Thanks, Christina, and thank you all for joining us today to discuss the not so glamorous, but increasingly business critical world of data privacy legislation. As people continue to join, feel free to comment in the chat with your name and company so we can get an idea of who's in the room. And as we get this session underway, as Christina mentioned, feel free to use the Zoom questions feature to talk to our panel. Today we're joined by a panel of experts who have navigated the rough terrain of policy in recent years to get their thoughts on risk mitigation strategies, what companies need to be mindful of with new legislation, and what the future holds for data protection. This is an issue that is particularly close to my heart. I work on the Marketing Center of Excellence here at Insight, and a lot of what I focus on is working with product marketing teams who are trying to bring together a lot of collateral around how we deal with compliance, what the future of data protection holds, and ultimately how we can use data protection as a strategic competitive advantage. Our first guest is going to be Gary Kibel, who is a partner at Davis & Gilbert, specializing in digital media, technology and privacy, intellectual property and marketing. Gary also serves as general counsel to the Performance Marketing Association, and he joined us a couple of years ago to discuss GDPR and CCPA. So we're very grateful to have him present today on three recent developments in data protection and privacy in the form of the CCPA expansion, CPRA in California, the new Virginia bill, CDPA, which was passed in February of this year, and also CPA, the Colorado Act that is fresh off the presses and was passed last Thursday. Following the presentation from Gary, we'll be joined by Henry and Florian. Henry Jiang is the Chief Information Security Officer at Diligent. Diligent, for those who don't know, is the largest governance, risk, and compliance SaaS provider, serving more than 1 million users from over 23,000 organizations across the globe. And Florian Winterstein is the CEO of Jedox, an enterprise performance management software solution that helps optimize value creation across your business. Jedox works with more than 2,500 customers, including Microsoft, McDonald's, and ABB. Both Henry and Florian have helped their rapidly growing companies adjust to the new world of data legislation in America and Europe, so CCPA and GDPR, living in both those worlds. And we'll be getting their thoughts on how to best stay compliant, what's next in terms of global legislation, and how users truly feel about companies' usage of their personal data. So for now, I'll pass it over to Gary to kick us off with a presentation on the second wave of data privacy legislation. And as mentioned, feel free to use the questions feature and the chat as we progress.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. And it's good to be here with everybody. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So I have some slides to go through. Okay, so hopefully you are seeing slides right now. I am somehow going to go through the very complex world of privacy law in the US in 20 minutes, which forgive me for going somewhat quickly, but there's a lot going on here in the US, and I'll try to touch on most of the important issues. Just going through my slides here. This is me and my contact information. In case you want to stay in contact, I'll share that at the end as well. So what we're going to talk about today, we'll talk about CCPA a little bit, California, and the new CPRA. As Paul mentioned, we'll talk about the new Virginia law. There's a new Colorado law as well, some platform issues, and then what's happening on the federal level in the United States. I always start these conversations by comparing and contrasting the US and Europe, because if you've ever been through a GDPR exercise, then you realize how different things are in the US. In Europe and in the UK, you have the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. There's one law that applies to all processing of personal data. It's a very voluminous law, 99 articles, 173 recitals, and this law applies to all member states. They can deviate from it if they're allowed to, but for the most part, they implement GDPR as is. In the United States, in terms of a federal privacy law that applies to every business, there isn't any. The closest thing we have is one sentence under the Federal Trade Commission Act. And that one sentence says unfair methods of competition in or affecting commerce and unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce are hereby declared unlawful. That one sentence is what the federal government uses to regulate privacy policies, security breaches, all sorts of disclosures. It's the same one sentence they use to regulate advertising law. If you have a car commercial that says the car goes 0 to 60 in 5 seconds and that's not true, that's deception. Same thing if you post a privacy policy which says we're only going to use your personal information for the following reasons, and that's not true, that's deception. And that's all the Federal Trade Commission can do right now. Now, there are lots of other sectoral laws in the United States. There are laws that deal with children's information, healthcare personal information, financial services, and all the different states have different laws, which we're going to be talking about, that are popping up. So it's very complex. There's not one standard. One of the challenges in the US when you don't have one standard is definitions. Lawyers live and breathe with definitions. They drive everything. So in the EU, there's one definition of personal data. You can't argue what is personal data in terms of the definition. In the US, if someone says to you, we don't collect personally identifiable information, or PII, that doesn't mean anything because there's no one definition of PII in the United States. There are different definitions under different laws, so you need to have the conversation about what law are you talking about and what definitions apply. So that's why when California came along, this was a big deal. The nation's first comprehensive consumer privacy law. Now, not to put down any of the other states in the United States, but if the first comprehensive consumer privacy law came out of North Dakota or Iowa or New Hampshire, I don't think anyone would have paid as much attention to it. But it came out of California, one of the largest economies in the world, so it's a big deal. The CCPA introduced new rights that were probably good business practices, but that were not legal requirements up until CCPA. Number one was a greater reliance on transparency through privacy policies to tell consumers exactly what information is being collected about them and how it's being processed. I guarantee that if you did not update your privacy policy for CCPA, that your privacy policy is currently not in compliance. Number two, it gave consumers rights to access their information, to find out what information an organization may have about them, to request deletion of that information, and to opt out of the sale of their personal information. We'll unpack a lot about that. But previously, if a consumer reached out to you and says, I want you to delete all my information, unless you had made that commitment in a privacy policy or elsewhere, you didn't have to. You could say to the consumer, sorry, we don't delete data no matter how much you beg. But CCPA really changed that approach. Under the CCPA, you're either a business, a third party, or a service provider. Under the GDPR, we have the controller processor distinction. But in California, you're one of three possible parties. A business, straightforward, is pretty much the one that owns the data, that controls how it's going to be used. Skipping to the third one, a service provider, that's one who basically follows the instructions from the business. And the middle one, a third party, is anyone else who gets the data from a business. Now, as you'll see, there's three definitions here. Under GDPR, there's two definitions, controller and processor. So they don't always line up perfectly. And there are a lot of debates sometimes with European companies about whether or not a processor is a service provider in the US, or can they be a business? And it doesn't always line up perfectly. Definitions, again, I'd go into lots of definitions because those are so important. Under the CCPA, personal information is defined very, very broadly. It's not just name and email address and physical address. It's any unique personal identifier, such as an IP address, a tracking cookie, browsing history, geolocation, even inferences drawn from the personal information can be deemed personal information. So it's extremely broad. If you have a website and you collect the IP address, or you drop a cookie for a persistent identifier to track a user, you are collecting personal information. The right to know that individuals have is they can reach out to the company and say, I want to know the categories of information you've collected, the categories of sources from which you collected it, the purpose for which you're using this information, the categories of third parties with whom you share the information, and the specific pieces of information. Again, this is a right only to California consumers. So if the consumer from Oregon or Washington State or New York reaches out to you and asks for this information, you've got the right to say no unless you've contractually made the obligation otherwise. One of the big things in CCPA is that it gives consumers the right to opt out of the sale of their personal information. There's a lot to unpack there, because you may say to yourself, wait a minute, I don't sell personal information. That's not my business model. But the definitions are so broad. We spoke about how the definition of personal information is extremely broad. The definition of sale is very broad. It's not just selling personal information for cash. It's any selling, renting, releasing, disclosing, disseminating, even making available the information for valuable or monetary consideration. So what does that mean? Yes, if you sell it for money, that's a sale. But if you allow a third party to put a tracking pixel on your website and collect data that they can use for their own purposes, and in exchange you get valuable analytics, that can be deemed the sale of personal information to a third party. And if you are deemed to be selling personal information to a third party, you must have a link on your homepage with these 6 exact words: do not sell my personal information. Most companies don't want to put those 6 words on their homepage. What can happen under California if things go wrong? Well, there's no private right of action, meaning an individual cannot sue you for violating these privacy practices unless there's a security breach. In the event of a security breach, individuals can sue, which means class action attorneys can sue. The damages that you can be imposed come from the Attorney General's office. They can impose damages of $2,500 per violation or $7,500 if the violation is intentional. So to finish my compare and contrast with California and GDPR, the territorial reach under GDPR is much broader. In California, it's a bit narrower. We have different definitions of personal information and personal data. GDPR is a definition of sensitive data, these special categories of information. GDPR also focuses a lot on internal data security. That's not a focus of CCPA. And GDPR gives rights such as for audits and breach notification. Again, that's not part of the CCPA. GDPR requires data protection officers in certain situations, deals with cross-border data transfers. Again, not part of the CCPA. One of the biggest things is penalties, as you see there in the last row. I talked about the penalties under CCPA. The penalties under GDPR can be extremely crushing, 4% of your annual revenue or 20 million euros, whichever is greater. And who can enforce it? In Europe, all the member states can enforce GDPR. California, it's just the California Attorney General. So maybe we were breathing a little sigh of relief in the United States about CCPA because it was not that bad. And then along came CPRA, the California Privacy Rights Act. CPRA was a ballot initiative, meaning that the legislature didn't pass this law. It was drafted by sponsors, which collected enough signatures in California to get the CPRA on the November ballot for the election. You may have heard we had an election here in the US in November. Kind of a big deal. It made the press. Well, the CPRA was approved by California voters on November 3rd by almost 60% of the vote. The law takes effect on January 1, 2023, but it has a look back to data collected as of 2022. So what's different between the CPRA and the existing CCPA? Firstly, they increased the threshold to carve out more small businesses. There was a threshold that it only applies to companies that have 25 million in gross revenue or process 50,000 or more records or get 50% or more of your revenue from selling personal information. They upped the device number up to 100,000 consumers. They added new definitions. And again, I'm a lawyer. I get on and on about definitions. I won't go into too much detail here. But under CCPA, there was this definition of selling personal information. And as I mentioned, it was so broad. CPRA is going to break up selling information to selling and sharing. Sharing is really focused on the practice of cross-context behavioral advertising. That means collecting data from a consumer on one service to serve targeted ads on unaffiliated third-party services. And they've broken this up to decide whether or not you're selling or sharing. If you are sharing, doing that advertising, now that link at the bottom of the page must say, do not sell or share my personal information. So you would need to update these links that are at the bottom of the website. But you may get out of the of the need to say you don't sell information if you're only sharing information. CPRA also introduces a new definition of sensitive personal information. Information such as precise geolocation, financial account information, health data. If you are processing sensitive personal information under CPRA, now you need to have yet another link at the bottom of your website. This link will say, limit the use of my sensitive personal information. And the individual will be able to reach out and request that you limit certain processing of that data. But it's all an opt-out basis, which is much better than GDPR approach, which sometimes is opt-in. You're going to have many more contractual requirements in 2023, not just because of CPRA, but also because of Virginia and Colorado. You're going to have much more detailed contracts with your service providers, almost akin to a DPA, a data processing addendum like you would have in Europe. And CPRA has many more of those internal data security obligations. I just have one example up here. It requires the concept of data minimization, only really collecting, using, and retaining the data you need. Don't just take the vacuum cleaner approach and suck up every piece of data you can possibly acquire. Probably the most impactful thing about the new California CPRA is that it requires the establishment of a new agency called the California Privacy Protection Agency, the CPPA. It's a real alphabet soup here with all the different laws and agencies. Pretty soon we'll be talking about the FBI and the CIA and the PTA. There's so many different things here. So the California Privacy Protection Agency, this is a huge, huge issue because this will be the first standalone privacy regulator in the United States. They will have nothing else to do but enforce privacy laws. Other agencies have many different purposes. So if these guys, their only obligation is to enforce privacy laws, you can assume they're going to be very, very active. All right, we always talked about California, and then Virginia came along as the second comprehensive consumer privacy law in the United States. Virginia's law takes mostly the CCPA opt-out approach, requiring greater transparency, access rights, the opt-out of sale. It adds in a lot of the GDPR internal data security issues. Again, there's no private right of action, which is great, so the class action lawyers cannot sue you. The law was signed a few months ago, and it takes effect January 1, 2023, same day as CPRA. Some of the unique things about Virginia, it has a higher threshold to carve out small businesses. So it goes with that 100,000 consumers of personal data. And it very clearly says that it only applies to an individual who's acting in their individual or household context. So it very clearly carves out B2B activities, which is very, very good. It has the opt-out approach from selling personal information, but their definition of sale is much narrower. It's really just a sale for monetary consideration. It doesn't have that other valuable consideration prong. The Virginia law has a definition of sensitive data that could be precise geo, children's data, biometric. But here's the most impactful thing about the Virginia law. If you're going to process sensitive personal data under the Virginia law, you need to get an opt-in. This is one of the first opt-in requirements in the United States, a broad opt-in requirement. And precise geo is defined, I believe it's 700 or 1,850 feet. So if you're collecting precise geo, now you have to get an opt-in, not just an opt-out. The Virginia law has other GDPR type terms. They take the approach of calling the parties controllers and processors. They require data minimization. They require reasonable internal data security. They require companies to go through data protection assessments, such as DPIA's, data privacy impact assessments under GDPR. You have to conduct these assessments for certain activities, such as selling personal data or engaging in targeted advertising. So there will be a greater need for internal record keeping about these activities. Let's do another compare and contrast chart between California CCPA, California CPRA, and Virginia CDPA. Forgive me if I run through things very quickly. You can certainly reach out to me, and I'm happy to share a redacted copy of slides if you want to see this. So they all have a carve out for small businesses. Effective dates are a little different. That opt-in for sensitive data for Virginia is a really big deal. The definition of sale is a little bit narrower in Virginia. Response times are very similar, 45 days. Cure periods. CCPA currently has a cure period for a violation. So if you violate the law and the Attorney General's office reaches out to you, you have 30 days to cure the violation before there's any liability. CPRA takes away the cure period. Virginia has a cure period. That's great. Mostly no private right of action except for security breaches. We talked about the new California agency. The other folks are just using their attorney generals for enforcement. There are lots of carve-outs to carve out certain B2B activities. We talked about definitions, and then we talked about the need for data privacy impact assessments. So I was done with my slides, and then as Paul mentioned, last week, the third state came online with the third comprehensive consumer privacy law, the Colorado Privacy Act, CPA. The CPA was signed last week by the governor. It has an effective date of July 1, 2023, so 6 months after CPRA and the Virginia law. And it kind of takes things to the next level. It's really California plus Virginia equals this new law in many regards. It has an opt-in for sensitive data. It takes the controller processor approach. Thank goodness no private right of action. So the class action lawyers cannot line up and start suing you on July 2nd, 2023. And it has a cure period, which is fantastic. And it's a 60-day cure period, which is even better, but there's a sunset on the cure period. Cure period is going to go away in 2025. And by the way, this cure period is a fantastic thing. Under California, I have seen enforcement letters from the California Attorney General so far, and it lists all these violations, but then at the end says you have 30 days to cure these violations, which is really fantastic. One thing this is doing a lot is upending the advertising world, but some of the portals are coming up with their own solutions. Google, for instance, has come up with a plan to deal with CCPA by carving out California consumers if you go into your Google portal and you turn on what's called RDP, Restricted Data Processing. If you turn that on in your Google portal, Google will treat California residents differently, and Google will act like a service provider so that you are not deemed to be selling personal information to Google. Facebook has something very similar. Facebook's program is called Limited Data Use. So you can log into your Facebook portal, same thing, turn on limited data use, and then Facebook will start to act automatically like a service provider so that you are not deemed to be selling them personal information. And then the $64,000 question. When is the federal government going to come up with one comprehensive law that will preempt all these state laws? Because we're up to 3, and there are more that are in the pipeline. Well, we had all been hoping that the federal government would get their act together and pass a law in 2021. I think that's becoming less likely. There's a lot of debate. There's kind of 3 issues kicking around in Congress right now on this point. Number 1, should any federal privacy law preempt all the state laws? And there's not agreement there. And the delegation in Congress is dominated by California legislators. Number 2, should there be a private right of action? There are pros and cons. Do you want the class action lawyers just out there trying to make a quick buck? Or do you want the private citizens to be able to sue to remedy things and basically be an enforcement arm of the government? And the third issue that's being debated is a lot of lawmakers are saying maybe we don't need a federal law now that all the states are passing federal laws. So I think this is going to get much messier in the United States before it gets easier. I think you're going to see more states coming online with their own privacy laws. New York may be the next one in the pipeline. Florida has been kicking one around. Washington State failed in their third attempt to pass one, but I don't think we're going to see a federal law anytime soon. So unfortunately, we need to deal with this complexity, and I think 2022 is going to be a big year of compliance for everybody trying to comply with all these new laws. So with that, I somehow did that in 20 minutes, as promised, and now I'll kick it back over to Paul.
Awesome stuff. Thanks so much, Gary. That was very insightful. I think we'll all be watching the federal move eagerly. To just for the sake of acronyms alone, I couldn't get over that the latest bill just happens to be CDPA. I feel like some of these legislative entities could do with a branding class. So yeah, now that we have the 101 on the legislation and where we've come in the last, I guess it's 6-7 years at this point, I'd love to pivot the conversation to more of a strategic, tactical emphasis and bring in our other two guests, Henry and Florian. And maybe Henry, starting with yourself, I know in your role as CISO at Diligent, one of the things that we had discussed is it's one thing to come up with a policy of compliance. It's a whole other thing to execute on that policy. So I'd love to hear, from Diligent's approach, are there any best practices or rollout strategies that you recommend? We see this emerging role. I saw Gartner's reporting that by the end of 2022, 1 million organizations will have a privacy or a data protection officer. From your own experience, can you talk us through how you've effectively navigated this rough terrain and kind of best practices that you recommend for other portfolio companies?
Sure, Paul. Yeah, thanks for bringing this topic up. I think we all heard what Gary presented on a very complex landscape on the laws. I think the number one thing being from security, whether it's a CISO or IT, is that don't pretend to be the legal expert, right? That's the one thing you don't want it to do. In fact, when we create our security policy, we have clearly defined the governance of security policy, which means the regulation of laws, the interpretation of the laws certainly belong to legal. In this case, in Diligent, we have a data privacy officer, right? Who's also general counsel, who's responsible for that. I think that's the most important part from a security governance point of view. We are, for the most part, security practitioner. We are very good at what we do in terms of technical control. We certainly need to have a very good understanding of laws and regulations. By having said that, don't pretend to be a lawyer trying to interpret the regulation. How does it translate to day-to-day operation, right? So the policy, start with a very good comprehensive policy. We have seen lots of organizations, especially the small, medium-sized business, they don't have a policy. So you don't know who's actually responsible for what, right? Which is challenge number one. And for some organizations, sometimes they would adopt a common, standard security policy that's not really applicable to their business model. In doing so, you inherit a lot of risk, meaning you are saying you're going to do this, you have this control, but in fact, you're not doing that, right? I think the second most important thing to do from a governance point of view is that your policy should really reflect your business model. You should really understand what can you do. When we use the word must, shall, right, may, just like legals, those have the different meanings, right? So these verbiage combined with the policy give our audience, meaning our internal employees, a good understanding how we govern the security, which data protection is a part of. Now, from a more technical execution side, that's where the technical controls need to be thought at, right? Whether it's a DLP, data leakage prevention, which the product has been matured over years. And in fact, Microsoft has a lot of DLP control built into the product. The costs are starting going down. But definitely leverage those technical solutions to provide the technical control where you can classify the data and prevent the data leakage, right? Both from your internal employee, we call inside threats, as well as external attackers whose obviously the goal is to penetrate the network, steal the data used for other purposes. So this is just a high-level view on from security practitioner. Really, there's a governance, execution translate to the culture, the understanding of the privacy, and come up with the effective technical controls to protect the data in a proactive manner where possible.
Yeah, I think that point on culture is super interesting. That it permeates multiple teams throughout an organization. And Florian, obviously, you're dealing with, as Gary highlighted, the substantial challenges of GDPR and the very real business threat that poses towards, obviously companies dealing with PII in EMEA. Can you talk to us a little bit about your approach, your team structure, and how you tackle this from the early days of data legislation in the mid-2010s?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on one hand side, I'm happy that we don't have to deal too much in detail with all these different kind of state regulations. On the other hand, Gary stated pretty right that the GDPR is really a pretty complex set of rules. And surprisingly, it is not even with these tons of articles fully built out. So there is still a lot of gray zone. And especially with this gray zone, we as executives running a business and kind of needs balancing these aspects come into a proper type of process and need of a process to decide and to weight and to balance the various aspects. So, I mean, a couple of aspects here, but on a nutshell, it's always a cross-functional approach, right? I mean, I just can echo, don't assume yourself as a legal expert. You need to have a legal expert on the team. We at Jedox, we even pulled in an external party that is solely dealing with data protection and data privacy questions. And that was maybe the first step also how to embarking on such a journey. It has to do with cleaning up, right? So usually you're not kind of clean sheeted. There is a history, rules and laws have evolved, and you need to kind of set a kind of starting point. And this kind of cleaning up, this is what we have done with this external party, which is still accompanying us. But in the phase number 2, we created an internal responsible. This sits within our legal, so data protection, data privacy officer, which is embedded in our total IT and data security context, whilst the broader data security context is more towards certification and audits and these type of stuff, where certainly privacy aspects play an increasingly important role, but are not yet core and center. So this is why we have sitting the privacy and data protection responsibility under and with our legal department, right? So this is core and center, and of course then there is a cross-functional team with this external party. We also use some law firms to that regards. But in a nutshell, and again, summing this up, it always comes back to what is the need as a business, where we simply have to execute on certain activities that have to do with private data, and in the same moment, how to do that very properly in the given legal framework. So, the key decision point there is really like balancing the different kinds of interests. So we as Jedox, obviously B2B provider, have a certain interest and need to do business. So no one would doubt that. On the other hand, we have individuals that have the right to have control about their private data, information, right to be forgotten, and all these things that have been already presented. And in a nutshell, it is really like assessing what is the kind of assumed consent of our customers, of these individuals, with their rights. So if someone is on LinkedIn, are you allowed to mail this someone? Are you allowed to pull this someone into the database? Does having a profile on LinkedIn meaning being open for B2B business? Is it more like a mass mailing? Is it more like individual mailing? So I can talk more about these details, but potentially you have more questions about the broader scope. So that said, there are a lot of more insights to share, but hopefully on a high level, it is clear how we have embarked to this journey and how we have embedded that organizationally.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it makes a lot of sense. And I think, the natural tension that exists between those competing priorities of, compliance, risk mitigation, and core business objectives is obviously ever present and comes with a lot of strong opinions in the room. Henry, I'd be interested in hearing your experience as a CISO collaborating with a CDO, trying to make sure that a company with the reputation of security excellence and privacy like Diligent, how do those three forces kind of compete within your organization? And then as a corollary to that, how do you make sure, as you kind of spoke about earlier, that everybody in the organization is singing off the same hymn sheet of our approach to privacy and the value of user data?
Yeah, I think from organizational structure, legal team members definitely should be part of the security or risk management structure. Depends on size, different size organization. For more especially in the US, a financial service company typically follows a 3-line of defense model, right? First line, which is the CISO/IT. Second line is risk management or enterprise risk management. And third line is audit. Diligence, so I came from the banking environment, very comfortable with the 3-line defense, right? Because you check balances. Where diligent, it's a mid-market company, software company. We don't have the three distinct functions. By having said that, you still need to build the 3 functions inside of whatever the structure you have, right? So in our case, we have a risk management committee, which comprises of IT, security, legal. We don't have compliance, marketing, ready for PR, and external entities. For example, instance retainer services providers, cyber insurance providers. Creating this virtual entity for the risk management. I think that's a very important structure. Should be formal, should be documented, should meet on a regular basis and review the risk, whether it's a data risk, risk related to regulation or material risk involved operation. I think that's one very important step to establish. From an operational point of view, we build the entire incident response process with this in mind. For example, when we go through our instance investigation, once the analyst determine it's a potential data leakage or incident involving data, when they click on that box, it automatically trigger legal review, right? Again, as I said earlier, security is not in the position, even we understand the law, perhaps a little bit more than the regular population, but we're not gonna, able to follow up, to the detail as Gary alluded to. So from incident response point of view, that should trigger a automatically legal review, right? Either automatic or manual, but that's a process you have to follow. So bring the data, collect the data, try to articulate the data in context, in the right context, and give legal enough information so they can provide advice, right? So that's the second step. Unfortunately, some instances might pass, right? The containment phase, your data is already out there, right? That's even further involved with the legal, marketing, and outside firm to do remediation, which means how you communicate your potential data leakage incident to your customer, to regulators. All that really need to be, there's a lot of planning coming into that. It's not trivial that you think you can do that on the fly. So the best way to do that is to develop a playbook. So playbook meaning, sort of a tabletop exercise. You follow the prescriptive playbook, and then you bring the team on a regular basis to build a muscle memory, right? At least they know, okay, that's the flow. When this thing happens, I'm anticipated or expected to be involved at this phase, right? You have to do that. It's just so important that you got the muscle memory built, and also have those communication, put in writing, put in the handbook beforehand. I can't emphasize how important it is to have the preparation phase. And the last piece, obviously, is that actually I was following Florian saying about engaging outside legal also has additional value, right? So, for example, your conversation with the outside legal firm will be protected as a part of attorney-client privilege, which also shield you from being disclosed certain information to your customer, right, or regulator. So all that need to be really well thought in advance, in the book, in the playbook, and executed when the incident arises.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your point to the external communication kind of brings me to my next question. And if people have questions, as I said, feel free to put them in the chat. We're happy to field them. But Florian, when we think of a culture of users that are choosing to work with businesses based on their approach to how they use their data, they are increasingly cognizant of what they're doing on the internet and the value of their online journey, essentially. How valuable how important do you see that as a priority for Jedox? And can you talk about your implementation of external communication strategies for talking to your users and building up that trust in your company, especially with increasing legislation in the market?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first that to do business is a must-have, and to comply with these rules is a must-have as well. So in a nutshell, what we can see, and I think Gary's presentation lined it out, that in more and more geographies in the United States, but also globally, these rules are taking up more and more. So from what was potentially previously a bit more like a selling argument, like, hey, look, we are so careful and sensitive about your data, this is becoming more and more KO criteria. Right, in our business tenders, RFPs, customer conversations, these questions increase, and that's to the point of Henry, that you need to have a proper structure, also a structure and organization and structure and all a ton of material that allow you to communicate internally and externally properly about that. I still think that there is a certain bucket and benefit of communicating and very transparently about that. But in a nutshell, it really comes down to have a policy that exactly describes what data we are collecting and what happened with this data, how we are controlling them, how we are processing them, etc. There is a slight difference between IT security in my eyes and when we provide as a software cloud provider, when we provide our services to our customers, it behaves a bit different compared, as we are more the data processor, compared to our internal systems where we have HR data, where we have marketing data, which are really in essence private data, and where we are not only the processor, but we are the controller, and by that a bit more responsible, and we may have sub-processors. So give you an example, and we use Salesforce. Obviously, we have customer information, personal, individual contact information in our Salesforce. As those data make it into Europe, the entire company globally falls under GDPR. And I mean, that said, means we need to have a global kind of program. The global program, in my eyes, started really with an executive sponsorship. So I'm completely up for this. I'm standing behind. I'm communicating regularly, externally and internally to it. As said, externally to make our customers comfortable, to use it a bit as marketing still, and internally to simply raise awareness and put in top of mind of the people. Secondly, we bespoke roughly what the team setup Crossfunctional is about. Obviously, you need budget. All this costs money. So we are talking about significant amount of money that we are spending as a one-off, but also continuously there. And then it's about a program. It's about a playbook. It's about embedding that into audits. And it's educating the broader employees that they deal with these data. It's not only the HR departments, it's also the IT departments. It's especially the marketing departments, and that need refreshment. So where this all comes from, it also needs some data, some paperwork, right? It's also about what has the company done in terms of documenting our efforts, documenting our aspects and perspectives, and documenting the decisions we have taken to justify in case of a claim or of questions that we really seriously have cared about it. And it's not kind of a sales kind of exercise. It's really about a very objective assessment of the different opinions. So that said, and to give some insights how we then constructed the program, and we, for example, said, we just will address people on an individual basis, so no mass basis. Secondly, if we buy data, we buy it from reliable sellers and not kind of sellers that provide whatever data sources and where it is not clear that people have given consent and so on. Then obviously we need opt-out functionalities and capabilities, and this is where we differentiated the regions, right? So for example, in Germany or in the German-speaking area, we are using a double opt-in and of course the opt-out, versus in other regions we are more going towards the opt-out, as we assume consent once people fill in a form, etc. And there is also a distinguishment where the information came from. So very practically, if you're on an exhibition fair, if you have a good conversation, you hand over business cards, yeah, send me that presentation. I think you would usually not send an email like, can you please confirm your email address and opt in that I should send you what we already promised by a handshake, right? So it also needs to be kind of aligned of what the business is. So there is a difference if we talk to someone in person. There is a difference if someone fills in a web form. There is also a difference if we simply purchase a contact information. So I think this is exactly what the playbook and what the program has to consider, these very various aspects and always balance and weight against each other what might the individual want to achieve with this contact or with providing some contact information versus what is our legitimate interest to do or to foster business.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a super interesting point on these playbooks somewhat spiraling out of control when you consider all of the various permutations of interactions and data usage. And I think, you know, in recent years, well, I've certainly been stunned by the pace of new legislation that's coming out. And, you know, when we consider, I think there's 40 countries today actively have data privacy laws. I was reading a Gardner report recently that said 65% of the world's population by the end of 2023 will be covered under these laws. That's up from 10% last year. So I would love to hear from everybody, and if Gary's still on the line, also him. Let's consider the next 5 years of data privacy legislation. What, maybe starting with Florian, what is on your mind when you consider the risks and opportunities posed by this area, and what's your number one kind of takeaway for Jedox that you would focus on?
Yeah, I think with our actual approach, we kind of already had a look into the future and built something that is kind of scalable for the future. So I think the big cornerstones are data collection is increasing since years and will increase, right? So the kind of, let's say, pressure or interest to kind of control it and kind of own it, that will definitely increase in parallel, which leads to increasing legislations. That said, we need to have a proper executive sponsorship, team, processy, playbook in place that on one hand side explain how transparently we act with the information that we are collecting or that we are given. And in the same moment, we of course also need to ensure our business here at Jedox, right? And it's not that this is a bad intent. I mean, the people out there, they of course want business with us, right? These 2,500 customers, they want interaction with us. So it's not about like restricting that. It's more like approaching it and handling it in a proper way as usual, and that needs a well-defined program and approach. And for companies like ours, maybe as a last sentence, being Insights portfolio companies, and certainly we are all up for growth and growth at scale, that needs to scale, right? So bringing in, and this is what I mean by clean sheeting at the beginning, bringing in data processing agreements with our 2,500 customers, that is at scale, that is an amount, right? This is also capacity. So this is clearly what you need to consider, a structure that can scale, a structure that can grow, and a structure that in the essence of the mechanics can consider new and changing environment in terms of the regulations. And I mean, Gary described exactly that kind of progress there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to, yeah, I'm still here. I'm happy to chime in. Can't turn on my video right now, but I'm happy to chime in on what I see going forward. I mean, I think the first thing you need to do is think about what law applies to you, because you may have customers or clients all over the world, but are you really subject to the laws of every single country in the world? And the second thing I would think about is, once you determine what applies to you, are you going to do a one-size-fits-all? Are you going to go with the strictest standard that applies anywhere in the world? Or are you going to have different standards for the European customers, the California customers, the South American customers? Are you going to treat them differently? And then the last thing I would say, it's really important to stay on top of the partners and service providers you work with. You really need to understand what they're doing, what data of yours they're collecting and processing. Someone may come to you and say, oh, let's just throw a pixel on your website so we can do the following things. You got to stop and understand, what are they doing? What data are they going to collect? How are they going to use that? And how does that fit into my legal compliance program? So it's a lot of, asking questions before you leap.
Absolutely. Anything to add to that, Henry?
I would just I definitely agree with the Gary, right? So when we build the security program, first I worked for the financial service many years. We always follow this approach where we want, exam the most strict law, right? Whether back then was GLBA, it was 2014, 15. There's only federal law. We can use the financial service GLBA. Then the CCPA come along. We always want to use the most strict privacy law to build the security program. I think that's probably, yes, there's a lot of work. Perhaps there's a bit of a work in the beginning to build the infrastructure, right? Culture, compliance, and the technical control. But the payout is great, right? Now you can use that existing framework. You might have to add some components, as a different additional requirement comes in. But you have foundationally, you have a good framework to start with. For me, I think that's probably the most bang for the buck approach, right?
Yeah, for sure.
There is maybe one point, Paul, because you asked also in terms of development in the future, and when we move beyond the, let's say, pure or narrow privacy regulations and laws that will increase. A key point that we have considered, and I think is already kind of on the horizon to come closer, is that we will see in all these audits, ISO, SOC, etc., that we will see that component way more dominant as it is today, right? Right now, it seems to be more a smaller piece, but being prepared to embed that into the various audits and certifications that a company like Jedox, and I think you once diligent also need around the world. I think this is something should be prepared. So that also means that the teams kind of have to collaborate, or at least to be embedded to that degree.
Yeah, and I think that point, so obviously we've been talking about generally satiating national legislation or state legislation so far, and less of it is actually focused on the market that we're serving and users' demands. And when we see companies, multinational companies like Apple, message on their strategic competitive advantage being on this approach to privacy and things like right to be forgotten and right to erasure, I'd love to hear from the panel on what are you hearing from the market similar to demands for SOC compliance and greater levels of security. What are you hearing as increasing demands, and how are you matching what your partners are asking for?
I mean, on our end, it's relatively straightforward. There is no project anymore where, according to the region, there is a question about audit, right? So when in the US, SOC 2 is absolutely mandatory, and it's it was a selling point potentially in the past, and that selling point is, in our eyes, a bit going away because it becomes really KO criteria. If you don't have it, you're not at the dance, right? And similarly, with ISO 27000 whatever audits, I think these technical ones are really core and center for every requirement out there. So they become basic standard. And I mean, there is a lot to do in terms of properly documenting that, having proper materials to really also explain it within a sales process to our chief security, data protection officers, and so on. But it has become a kind of a must-have and KO criteria compared to a, let's say, advantageous selling point in the past.
Yeah, I also want to add, from a diligent in a global SaaS company, we also have noticed the customer increasingly aware of different regulation, whether it's regional or federal or state level. As a part of the review process now, the question where we store data become very much a examined topic. Right? Before it's, okay, you're a cloud provider, we're going to give you data. Now is, where's your data center? How is it going to secure? Do you classify your data? You definitely see a lot of a granular level of examination from the customer perspective. Even our auditor, we're also certified SOC 2. Even our auditor, right, the audit report becoming much more follow that trust but verify, right? Yeah, you have a good governance, great, but show me the evidence, show me your meeting minutes, show me your data classification tool. So I think this, to me, it's a healthy way to elevate security program, right? Because once you build a program with all the right components, you don't really, if you're comfortable present to a customer or to auditor, but you don't have that in place, that's where you will feel a lot of pressure to do so very, very quickly.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm very conscious that we have 2 minutes left, but I have one 30-second question for everybody, which is, at the very start of this, we discussed this entire area being a bit of a minefield and that there are major challenges to rolling out a compliance approach. In 30 seconds each, I'd love to get maybe one lesson that you learned in your individual rollouts, and also, one opportunity. So, when we think of the initial GDPR rollout, a lot of people thought a banner was, about cookies was sufficient. So a lot of people learned that lesson the hard way. One challenge, or one learning and one opportunity, maybe starting with Florian. Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks. Don't be shy in terms of tons of regulations out there. We as executives are here in the seats to support our business, but listen carefully to what is possible, and as usual, put proper structures, proper guideline, and a scalable concept in place for well balancing the different areas of interest.
Thank you, Henry.
I would jump in. Yeah, I think one takeaway for me is that as a technologist, on some of those things we're doing, control structured data, meaning data will collect systematically, right, in the applications, is a relatively easy. Unstructured data, your email message, your Excel file stored everywhere, contain all the regular data is hard. And that's really required the entire organization have that culture of, okay, what data do I have? How should I protect it? And that's a really hard thing to do, right? I mean, there are tools out there. We use Microsoft AIP for that. We give the data owner, right, a tool to do that, but still, it's a journey. I mean, we're still not percentage-wise, right? The percentage we like to be to classify this data, but it's a culture thing. We really have to continue promoting.
Yeah, excellent. And Gary?
Yeah, what I would say is that we always focus a lot on the laws, but I really say you should look at your compliance program with 3 things in mind. What are the legal requirements? What is your industry best practice? And what contractual requirements do you have? Because you may have signed contracts with customers that require things that are not set forth in the law. So you got to make sure you comply with all that. And in terms of opportunity, it's somewhat of an old phrase now, but I really think it's important. It's called privacy by design. That when you build any product or service, you really got to think about data usage and compliance and privacy issues at the outset. Don't let your organization build a product and then come to compliance at the end and say, all right, tell us what we need to stick on here to make it compliant with privacy laws. No, those conversations need to happen at the outset, and then you can build a better product if you're thinking about all those things through the product cycle.
Absolutely. I think that's a very useful tidbit to leave us on. Really appreciate all of your time, Florian, Henry, and Gary. I think this has been an invaluable run through on what the landscape looks like and real hands-on strategic advice on how companies should deal with compliance. The recording of this session, as Christina mentioned, will be up online pretty shortly. We'll ping everybody with that. But appreciate all of your time, gentlemen, and yeah, we hope to talk again soon.
Welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.